This is Seth Ward, and this is a PowerPoint presentation of Zionism and Israel. Europe in 1800 looked quite different from what it does today. The Polish kingdom had been gobbled up by Russia, by Prussia, and by the Austrians, represented here by the word Habsburg. The Ottoman Empire still controlled enormous tracts of southeastern Europe. France had begun its expansion under Napoleon, and you'll notice that Egypt is in the same color as France, indicating that Napoleon had already entered Egypt and had controlled large portions of it. In none of these areas were Jews liberated, were Jews enfranchised. Prior to the French Revolution, 1789, Jews had various rights, and most interestingly, in the Habsburg regimes, there was toleration that was promoted in the 1780s. But Jews were not full civil members of the society. Jews were by no means the only people who were disenfranchised. In most of the countries of Europe, the rule of a single religion had obtained. There was an established state religion, and people who were not in that religion very often had disabilities, even if they were Protestants as opposed to Catholics. Most of these countries had various different classes. Slavery or serfdom was still practiced in some of the areas, and on and on and on. The story of Zionism as a political movement starts in Europe in the 19th century, although I should mention that traditional Zionism, traditional longing of Jews to return to the Holy Land, started well before that, and that in the 1800s, in fact, the early Zionist movements, you might say proto-Zionist movements, were of religious Jews from Eastern Europe and the Tsarist Empire, who made their way to the land of Israel, and from Central Europe, from Yemen, and other places around the world, who made their way to the tiny corner of the Ottoman Empire, Jerusalem, and the other holy cities of the Holy Land. The French Revolution had this idea of universal citizenship, and Clermont-Tonnerre decreed in 1789, everything must be refused to the Jews as a nation, and everything granted to them as individuals. I have the French text on the slide. Napoleon famously convened an assembly of Jewish notables, asked them questions about their loyalty to France, their ability to marry French, from Jewish men to marry French women, for Jewish women to marry French men, and many other questions. You can check the link on Answers, the link that's from the Answers on the screen. That will give you the text of the questions and the answers of the Jewish notables. France had expelled the Jews in the 1300s, but there were Jewish communities in areas of the Rhine Valley and in southern France that had been conquered by Napoleon. The slide on the bottom in the center is a cannon in the city of Acre, which stopped the Napoleonic advance in the Middle East. In practical terms, the ways of the old regime were reinstated after 1815. But during the course of the 19th century, and especially after the revolts of the 1840s, Jews achieved citizenship rights in most places in Central and Western Europe. They also received rights as part of the Tanzimat in the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, this was what Jacob Katz has called a semi-neutral society. Jews still often had to accept baptism in practice in order to serve as doctors or lawyers, or to achieve university jobs, or even to succeed in the music business. In the middle of the century, in the 1850s, the Edgar Mortara case showed that the Catholic Church supported the value of baptism, even when it was done in secret and without family consent. The reaction against the decision of the Pope showed that the old taboos were breaking. The Austrians and the British supported the right of the Jews to retain the child. Edgar Mortara was a young man, a young baby, a boy, who was baptized by a servant in a Jewish family, who was worried that he was too sick and that baptizing might save his soul and might even save his life. Despite the fact that many people objected, Mortara remained Catholic, and in fact may have done so at his own choice, based on how he was educated. In the later 19th century, in the 1870s and 80s, we have the rise of anti-Semitic parties in what today we would call Germany and France. And in 1893, the Dreyfus case, shown here in the image, had Captain Albert Dreyfus accused incorrectly of compromising French security by leaking secrets to their arch-enemies, the Germans. Herzl's reporting convinced him that the Jews, even in France, the most civilized and most forward-looking country of all of Europe, the place where Jews had achieved the greatest equality, and the place where Jews could rise to high rank in the army, even in France, the situation of Jews was capable to be compromised by what today we would call anti-Semitism. We'll come back to Herzl later, but let's look now at 19th century Palestine. This part of the world had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire. It was ruled briefly by Muhammad Ali, starting in 1831. And we'll come to the restoration theology regarding Jews returning to the Holy Land. His conquest, Muhammad Ali's conquest of Palestine in 1831, may have been the inspiration for some of these ideas. I have an image here of the Mosque of Omar, as it was called by David Roberts, the Dome of the Rock, and you can see in the very distant part, you can see the Dome of Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. This is somewhat fanciful. Actually, this is extremely fanciful by David Roberts. In 1840, there was a blood libel in Damascus. This mobilized Jews in Europe, both in Britain, Moses Montefiore, and in France, and even in the United States. The B'nai B'rith organization seems to have had an impetus in part to respond to the blood libel in Damascus. The blood libel was an assumption that Jews had been involved in killing some people in Damascus. It was probably leveled by a French monk. The importance for our story is that Adolphe Crémieux in France and Moses Montefiore in Britain especially came to the Middle East, became involved, became committed to bettering the situation of Jews in the Islamic world, in the Ottoman Empire, in North Africa, in Morocco, which was independent, Tunisia, and other places, and began developing some of the institutions in the Holy Land in a much more modern 19th century style. I mentioned restoration theology in the previous slide. This is associated with the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper. He was probably among the first to call for Jewish resettlement in Palestine. I don't think he ever said a country without a people for a people without a country, but this is consistent with his ideas. Not only in Britain did Shaftesbury call for resettling of Jews in the Holy Land, in the United States, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon religion, prayed fervently for this and sent an emissary to the Holy Land to dedicate it for Jewish resettlement. In the Jewish world itself, there had been attempts to go to the Holy Land, to go to Palestine, especially among religious Jews in Eastern Europe. However, this is not the main narrative in Austria, in what became Germany, in France, and in Britain. The main narrative there has to do with the Reform movement, the response to the Reform movement, the development of a kind of middle path in historic Judaism, a scientific approach to Judaism, reforms in poetry and synagogue practice, and an enlightened approach to the outside world. This is part of the Zionism story because the Enlighteners were very much aware of the spirit of nationalism, among other things, that was dominant in Europe as Austria and Germany and some of the other countries developed a much more national-oriented rather than imperial-oriented determination of their national identity. In the Ottoman world, the period of Tanzimat had great amount of reforms. Jews, Christians, and Christians had two different communities. Jews, Greek Orthodox Christians, and Armenians became, at least in some sense, equal to Muslims in the Ottoman legal system of the Tanzimat. And I have a couple of the important dates there. The Ottomans lost land very quickly. Greece, Hungary, Egypt, and so on were lost to the Ottomans in the 19th century. I put constitutional reform and reform in land ownership on this slide because they would have an extremely important role in this story of the rise of Zionism. One of the ramifications of land reform was the registration of property in Palestine and procedures which in practice favored residents of a village concentrating the ownership in the leader of the village, essentially saying to the muhtar, the leader of a village, why don't you take care of this? And he registered everything in his own name, or he registered everything in the name of a family and so on. And it became easy for great landowners and very rich people in Istanbul, as well as eventually Jews, to buy large tracts of land in this way. The constitutional reform in 1876 was only partially trumped by Sultan Abdul Hamid's seizure of power in 1878, and meant that Ottoman law was very confusing with modern French civil law, with traditional Arab Islamic law, and many other pieces of legislation that went into it. In terms of the history of the State of Israel, Ottoman law as it was in place in 1917 and British law in the Mandate were considered to be continued unless and until they were modified by the independent State of Israel. This slide talks about some traditional notions in Judaism and how they were being reinterpreted in the beginning of the modern age, in the 19th century, or modern age for our purposes. There was a discussion about whether Judaism was a religion or a nation. It doesn't start with Clermont-Tonnerre and Napoleon, Jews as individuals or a nation. It goes back into a lot of Jewish material. The Haskalah, or the Enlightenment, and the science of Judaism, Wissenschaft des Judentums, reawakened interest in Hebrew, in folkways, in identity, in literature, poetry, fiction, math and science education, the writing of newspapers. The Haskalah movement was international, although perhaps it was centered in what today we would call Germany. There were Maskilim in Eastern Europe, there were Maskilim, enlighteners in North Africa, and many other places in the Jewish world. Many of them rethought how one should look at Judaism and look at it in a scientific way. The traditional material, however, was extremely important and had lots of what we would call Zionism ingrained in it. The blessings of the land and the blessings for Jerusalem were part of daily practice in the grace after meals recited by traditional Jews. The daily prayer and the Torah and Haftarah reading all had references to the land of Israel, and the biblical promises of patrimony and progeny to the ancient ancestors played an important role in Jewish prayer services. I mentioned briefly before that emancipation in Central Europe gave rise to anti-Semitism in Germany and France and elsewhere. The term anti-Semitism was coined in the 1870s by Wilhelm Marr, a newspaper journalist in Germany. In Eastern Europe, the situation was far worse. Rather than simply anti-Semitism, which would eventually grow to the Holocaust and be far worse than what happened in Tsarist Russia. In Tsarist Russia, though, in 1881, after the assassination of Tsar Alexander, there were a number of pogroms. There was an important pogrom in Kishinev and the failure of the Russian Revolution. There had been Jewish migration from Tsarist Russia already from the 1880s, but Russian Jews were far more scared after this, and after the 1880s, and especially after Kishinev, the pace of migration out of Russia picked up. Many of them went to the New World, to Britain, and especially to the United States and to other places in the Western Hemisphere. But some of them went to the land of Israel. As I mentioned briefly, the unification of Germany out of Prussia and Italy under the House of Savoy, the formation of European states in the debris of the Ottoman Empire, various attempts to create a Russian national state rather than a Tsarist state, and I should add Polish national movements. Many Jews still lived in areas that had been Poland gobbled up by the three imperial states, independence motions in Poland. All of these played an important role in terms of self-determination and ideas about nationalism that would have been in the air in Europe. Bialik was the first important poet of modern Hebrew, and you can spend some time with these links to see some of his poems. His most important poem for our purpose was Al Shchita, on the slaughter, a poem that he wrote about the slaughter in Kishinev. The poem gave rise to the idea that Jewish life in the Tsarist Empire was not considered to be valuable. I should note that in the 1880s, there had been some migration from the Tsarist Empire to Palestine, and certainly prior to the 1880s among religious Jews and even some secular Jews, and among the followers and the people funded by Montefiore and by other wealthy Jews, Baron Edmund de Rothschild and a number of others, funded agricultural settlements in the land of Israel, in Palestine. Bialik, writing in 1905, had been writing after the rise of the Zionist movement. By 1909, the first kibbutz was started. Kibbutz, a socialist settlement in which the settlers owned everything in common. And Tel Aviv, the first Jewish city, or the most important Jewish city, was founded. There had been Jewish, I'll call them colonies, founded in Rishon LeZion and in Rehovot and other places. Tel Aviv became by far the most important of them. Its original name was Ahuzat Bayit, and by the outbreak of the First World War, it had already become a very important settlement. It was originally a suburb of Jaffa and quickly outgrew the status as a suburb. Of the people on this slide, I'm only going to mention Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Ben Yehuda moved to Palestine in 1881 and spoke only Hebrew, apparently even to his dog. This aggravated his family, and he created many words that nobody understood, but he pioneered the idea of speaking Hebrew and teaching Hebrew in Hebrew. I don't know that during his much of his lifetime he had that much broad influence, but his approach was adopted by teachers in Jerusalem and in the new city of Tel Aviv, and very quickly after the end of the Ottoman period, especially with the popularity of the gymnasium in Tel Aviv. Hebrew speaking began to win out over Yiddish, the traditional Eastern European Jewish language, German, and any of the other languages that were spoken by European immigrants, and by Arabic and some of the other dialects that had been spoken locally by Jews as well as by non-Jews in the area. I promised you I would return to Herzl, and this slide gives you links to his to his most important works, The Jewish State, Judenstaat, which appeared in 1896, and I believe one of the links will send you to the Old New Land book, Alt Neuland, which appeared in 1902. Judenstaat was a pamphlet which discussed how a Jewish state could be established and laid out some of the political and economic moves that would be necessary. It was written as a result of his response to the Dreyfus trial and a feeling that the Jews were persecuted because, unlike the Italians and the Germans who were newly possessed of nation states, and the French who were reforming and creating a modern nation state out of the old regime, which had been gone for already 100 years, and some of the trials and tribulations of the 19th century. Unlike the French and the Germans and the Austrians and the Serbs and many of the other countries of Europe, the Jews had no state. And his idea was that Jewish sovereignty would be a necessary step to prevent Jews from being downtrodden and mistreated. The first Zionist Congress was called in 1897 as a response to Judenstaat. The Zionist movement had already gotten a name about 10 years earlier, but this was really the beginning of the movement. And his book, Alt Neuland, which appeared in 1902, was a kind of utopian novel which imagined what a state would be like. Many of the actors in the novel, many of the personages, the characters, had symbolic names. And the idea of the novel was that they'd visited Palestine in, let's say, the present 1902, came back 1922, and found the place transformed due to Jewish migration, due to Jewish independence, and so on. Herzl viewed it as a modern, I'll call it semi-socialist state. It was ruled by a free society in which Jews and Muslims and Christians would partake according to their desires. There was freedom of religion for all. Herzl, interestingly, talks about the rebuilding of the temple, but seems to be totally disinterested in that part. He has a very secular Passover service in which the highlight seems to be playing a recording of a speech rather than reciting the traditional Haggadah, and so on and so forth. A very, very important book. Alt Neuland was translated into Hebrew. The title given for the most important translation was Tel Aviv, and the town of Ahuzat Bayit changed its name to Tel Aviv shortly after that appearance. Herzl's brand of Zionism was not the only brand that was there. Cultural, religious, labor, other types of Zionists were in ready supply. Asher Ginsburg, Achad Ha'am, talked about the necessity of creating a cultural center. Aleph Dalet Gordon, A.D. Gordon, talked about the power of labor to redeem the land and used the notion of labor redeeming the land as a kind of secular response to the old idea of a messianic redemption or a divinely inspired redemption of the people of Israel. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook was appointed the chief rabbi of Palestine after the mandate began, and the Ottoman idea of a Chacham Bashi, a chief rabbi in Istanbul, was destroyed by the end of the Ottoman Empire. The British mandate thought it would be a good idea to have a chief rabbi in Palestine and appointed Abraham Isaac Kook. The First World War had very important ramifications for Palestine. Many of you are aware of Lawrence of Arabia, a very important film, and the attempts of the British with Lawrence and with other people to mobilize the Arabs to revolt against Ottoman rule. Sharif Hussein of Mecca was buried in Jerusalem. His progeny became kings in Jordan and Syria and Iraq as a result of that. There is debate as to what exactly was promised to Hussein and whether or not the British delivered on those promises. We will now turn to some of the other things that are here. The Balfour Declaration is dated on November 2nd, 1917. The British government looked with favor on the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine, with 2 additional clauses saying that it should not compromise the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish residents in the area, nor the rights of Jews resident outside of Palestine, both of which were considered to be very real issues by the government of Britain. The Balfour Declaration requires much more discussion than we can give over here. I also have a listing of Allenby Enters Jerusalem and a link to a very, very interesting document of the Blood and Oil, a documentary movie with a dramatization of Allenby's famous, it's actually, I don't know whether he ever delivered the speech. We have the documentary footage of him speaking. The text was publicized 2 days earlier than the speech, and I actually have no idea whether he gave the speech, whether the speech he gave was exactly the status quo declaration that he promulgated. Whatever it is, it's a very famous and extremely important narrative. In my course on the modern Middle East, I have a page of Hava Nagila, which actually was composed to celebrate the Balfour Declaration, according to the usual understanding, and sung at a ceremony. I've seen different dates. I believe it was in November of 1918 to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, although I've seen other dates there. Lawrence of Arabia had a map of what he thought should transpire in the Middle East as a result of British activity and Arab activity in World War I against the Ottomans. I note that he has Palestine and Mount Lebanon as special areas. He has the Arabs under Faisal in a large branch north of the what today is Saudi Arabia, and what today would be essentially Jordan and Syria and part of Iraq, and other ideas about the Arabs in northern Syria near the what today is the border of Turkey and in most of Iraq. This slide gives a very brief history of the British Mandate. Herbert Samuel was appointed the first commissioner. The British redefined the area in which the idea of the Balfour Declaration was to be applied very quickly on, a white paper of 1923. The Mandate believed that it was important to have a leader of the Arab community. They appointed Haj Amin al-Husseini as the Mufti, an interesting and, I think, tragic appointment. Had they appointed a member of one of the other families, one of the other leading families of Jerusalem, things might have been very, very different. Haj Amin, I don't think ever was in favor of of Jewish population, was inalterably opposed. Some of the other notables of Jerusalem were, I'll call them, more moderate. Most of the Jewish community in the British Mandate period was allied with the labor movement, but there was also a general revisionist movement of Jabotinsky and Begin. Jabotinsky penned an essay called The Iron Wall and emphasized the role of not so much arms, but included arms, to make sure that the Jewish settlements were considered to be immovable by the Arabs. He also talked about international support as a way to do that. The Jewish community grew. There were refugees from anti-Semitism in Poland very early in the post-World War I period. The dream of an independent and multicultural and safe Poland for Jews seemed to be falling apart. There were attacks on the Jewish community well before 1929. The attacks in Jerusalem, Safed, and Hebron actually started in 1928 with a Yom Kippur event when Jewish prayer at the Western Wall had separate prayers for separate segments for men and women, as is the typical practice in many traditional Jewish synagogues. The Arabs thought that they were making a change in the procedures at the wall and began to riot. The 1929 attacks ended the traditional Jewish community in Hebron. Part of the reason that there were no Jews in Hebron, and part of the discourse today about Hebron, goes to the fact that up to 1929 there had been Jewish residents in Hebron for centuries without break. After 1929, there were no Jews left there at all. In the 1930s, the situation heated up. There was a general Arab revolt. There was an Arab Higher Committee. There was a propaganda campaign. Violence in 1936 killed a few Jews. The British tried to moderate everything, but the situation got worse and worse. In 1937, the British set up a royal commission under the leadership of Lord Peel, who was the first to recommend that the solution would be partition. Unfortunately for Jewish history during the Holocaust, the Peel Commission and another commission in 1938 recommended partition and the establishment of Jewish and Arab states, but in 1939 the British government did not adopt this idea. They closed off Jewish immigration, limiting it to a very, very tiny number of Jews, and declared that no changes would happen in those policies without Arab agreement, which was unlikely at that point. The Peel Commission plan is seen on the left side map. The right side map had the UN plan that was adopted after World War II. You'll notice that both of them had ideas that there would be a Jewish state, an Arab state, and a place that would not be part of the Jewish or the Arab state. The Peel Commission recommended a corridor from Tel Aviv and from Jaffa basically to Jerusalem, and the post-World War II plan had Jerusalem and Bethlehem under UN administration. There were actually two different maps adopted by the UN, and the Jerusalem map included Bethlehem so that Jerusalem would have the same population of Jews and non-Jews, equal numbers of Jews and non-Jews, which would not have been the case had they limited to Jerusalem. Of course, for the British and many others in the European and Western Hemisphere world, the Bethlehem as well as Jerusalem were very holy cities to Christianity. The UN map that you see on the right is very similar to the map that transpired in the Independence War. The Western Galilee, the Northern Triangle, and sometimes called the Larger Triangle, was conquered by Israeli forces. There were some advances on the area that is north of Tel Aviv, and it's sometimes called the Little Triangle, and those segments were united. A corridor was opened to Jerusalem. The Gaza Strip area is smaller than it's shown on the UN area, and the line on the border with Egypt mostly became part of Israel in the final armistice. The area around Beersheba went back and forth in the UN plans based on very difficult to count populations of Bedouin who were not completely settled at that point. Beersheba became part of Israel after the 1948 war and the 1949 armistice. This is an image of the Declaration of Independence, an actual image. In my courses, I often show a dramatization and cast a giant shadow, which is actually a lot of fun. I will point out that some students ask me occasionally, where is Golda Meir? You can sort of see her in the final row of seats on the very right-hand side. This was in the Independence Hall, the Tel Aviv Museum at that time, a picture of Herzl and Ben-Gurion's address. He had arranged for the proceedings to be recorded, and we have a recording of the entire program. The link should give you the text of the Declaration of Independence. Here is a brief timeline of the period from the Declaration of State of Israel to the First Sinai Campaign in October 1956. You can see the Arab states' attack and the irregular forces before the declaration of the state. The first legislature took office on a very minor Jewish holiday called Tu B'Shvat in February of 1949. The things that were adopted early were the law of return. This guaranteed that Jews who would have been, actually Jews and non-Jews, who would have been exterminated by the Nazis because they were Jewish, were guaranteed the right of settlement in Israel. And the early period of time in the history of the state reflected an intense attempt to have displaced persons who wanted to settle in Israel to be able to do so. There were various camps. There were also transit camps for refugees from the Arab world as well. The Arab boycott had started before the State of Israel. In 1945 already, the Arab Union leadership had decided there would be a boycott of anything Jewish that was related to Palestine. After the declaration of the state, the boycott extended to a primary boycott of Israeli products, a secondary and tertiary boycott, which meant that they boycotted people who did business with Israel, and in some cases people who did business with people who did business in Israel. Back in the 1960s, Coke served Israel and therefore was not purchased by the Arab countries. Pepsi was found in the Arab countries and refused to bring its products to Israel, just as a for example. I'll mention briefly that the Jordanians occupied Jerusalem in the what is usually called the east side of town, the old city, and the Arab new city north of the old city. Desecrated some of the Jewish sites, paved over parts of the Jewish cemeteries in that area, and destroyed some of the synagogues and some of the other holy Jewish sites. The Jordanians also did not make it easy for the Israelis to exercise their right to Mount Scopus. The armistice had included an Israeli enclave inside, surrounded on all sides by Jordanian territory, and there was to have been a easy and free access. That was not maintainable. There was an attack on a convoy, and after that point, only military convoys, not civilian convoys, went to Mount Scopus. It had been the location for the university and for the hospital. They both found sites in western Jerusalem. Arab countries refused to mention the State of Israel by name. They called it Al-Kiyana Sahiyuniya, the Zionist entity. Gamal Abdel Nasser took power in Egypt, first in a coup in which he was probably the most important actor, leading a group of junior officers in 1952. In 1956, he removed the figurehead and took power in his own name. The Sinai campaign started in October of 1956, not so much as a response to Nasser taking power, but as a response to Nasser nationalizing the Suez Canal and appropriating the resources of the British and French governments. The British and the French, my guess is that they asked the Israelis whether they would give ground support, and the French were the major supplier of air armaments to the Israelis, and they could not resist joining in with the British and French. On the other hand, this is a very complicated thing, and there were a number of other scandals and issues and things flying back and forth. Whatever it was, Britain, France, and Israel tried to regain the Suez Canal. Eisenhower intervened, and the Sinai was returned to Egypt fairly quickly after the end of the successful campaign. This is a slide with some of the main dates from 1956 to 1976. The date is chosen somewhat arbitrarily. It does reflect not so much the Entebbe raid on July 4th, 1976, but the tremendous impact of a change in Israeli politics in 1977. The dates here include relations with West Germany, the Eichmann trial in 1960, an extremely important event that galvanized world attention towards Israel as being victimized by the Holocaust. Some of you may have seen the recent film about Hannah Arendt and her New Yorker pieces on the banality of evil. Eichmann portrayed himself as a bureaucrat who simply followed orders, but the trial showed the extent of the Nazi plans to systematically exterminate Jews. The PLO was formed in 1964, before the Six-Day War, although their charter was adopted only in 1968. The Six-Day War occurred in June of 1967. Prior to that time, Nasser had closed off Israeli shipping by blockading the port of Eilat, the way in which oil came to Israel from Iran. The Shah sent oil to Israel, and the portal of Israeli shipping to Africa and to the Asian world. So Nasser had also massed forces on the border of Egypt and Israel in the Sinai, had done things like proclaim to the fish that they should prepare their appetites because he was going to push Israel into the sea. The Israelis counterattacked, or I should say the Israelis had a preemptive attack on June 5th, in which they quickly destroyed Egyptian and Syrian air power. The Jordanians entered the war very quickly thereafter. By the end of 6 days of fighting, the Israelis had advanced through the Sinai Desert to the Suez Canal. They had advanced up from the Sea of Galilee to the heights looking down on Jewish settlements in the northern Jordan Valley, and had conquered all of the area of the British Mandate that had been annexed by Jordan in 1949. There are a number of other wars and events. The PLO was ousted by Jordan in 1970 and took up residence in Lebanon. This would prove very important later on. In 1972, at the Sinai Canal, there was a war of attrition, and also in 1972, some of you may have seen the film about Munich. There was the murder of many of the Israeli Olympians in Munich in the summer of 1972. The Yom Kippur War started in 1973 on the Jewish festival of Yom Kippur. It's sometimes called Ramadan War because it started in Ramadan according to the Muslim calendar. This was started by Anwar Sadat, and Nasser had died in 1970. And Sadat and his Syrian allies believed that they could surprise the Israelis. As it turned out, they in fact did. There was Israeli intelligence awareness on lower levels, but the government interpreted the intelligence to refer to a future attack on Israel and not something imminent. The Israelis suffered great casualties at first, but were able to advance on both fronts, the front in the Golan with Syria and the front in Egypt. The Egyptian army was encircled by Ariel Sharon very close to Cairo, and the Israeli army went further towards Damascus than it had been before. The Yom Kippur War ended with a kind of stalemate and a Security Council resolution. One of the ramifications is that the border with Syria was quiet from 1973 until fairly recently, where the civil war or the proxy war, the general fighting in Syria has meant that there have been a couple of times when there's been Syrian and Israeli fire across the border on the Golan. But other than that, it's been surprisingly quiet. It also led to eventual conclusion of peace between Sadat and Israel. The Egyptians and the Israelis concluded peace, in part because the Egyptians saw that their honor had been restored, given that they were able to attack Israel successfully at that time. 1975, however, was well before the Egyptian peace with Israel, and the UN had a resolution which equated Zionism with racism. This resolution unraveled after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it turns out that it was based in part, at least, on Soviet attempts to draw closer to the Arabs, and without Soviet support, the resolution unraveled. On July 4th, 1976, the 200th anniversary of the United States of America, there had been a flight with a lot of Americans on board that was diverted by Palestinian activists to Entebbe in Uganda. Prime Minister Netanyahu's brother was the leader of the raid, and in fact the only casualty of the raid. Unlike the Munich event, where many people were killed, only Yoni Netanyahu was killed in 1976, and the hostages on the flight were freed. I have some notes about myths and facts and the United Nations Resolution 242, which was adopted after the Six-Day War, and has language which is still part of the discourse about withdrawal of Israel from territories or from the territories that were conquered, and about the nature of what kind of borders should be adopted. I also have a reference to the three no's in Khartoum after the Six-Day War, in which the Arab governments assembled and reiterated their refusal to negotiate with Israel to recognize Israel as a state. I recommend that you read these pieces if you want to know more about those things. The next slide goes from the Likud elections in 1977, when Menachem Begin came to power in Israel, up to the fall of the Soviet Union, a process which actually started in 1989, went on for a year or two. You can read these very important dates: Sadat's visit to Israel, Camp David, and the treaty in 1979. Sadat was assassinated in 1981. In 1982, Israel began a very long involvement in the Lebanese field. The Lebanese Civil War had started in 1975 and pitted the PLO, the Palestinians who had gone there after they were thrown out of Jordan, the Syrians, the Christians, the Druzes, the Shias, the Sunnis, and there were different groups of Christians. Not all Lebanese Christians are Maronites. Maronites are a group that recognize the Pope, but they themselves reflect an ancient Syrian church. So they have some things which are distinct from Roman Catholics. They're not Roman Catholics, they're Maronite Catholics. They were the dominant group in Lebanon at one point, and the creation of Lebanon as a state reflected the interest of the French to protect their Christian clients. Hezbollah began to be organized. Most people consider their first actions to be in 1982 or 1983, especially with the bombing of U.S. Marines and French soldiers. 1987 represents a watershed inside the State of Israel. The PLO had been outside the State of Israel, and inside the State of Israel from 1967 to 1987, for about 20 years, Jews and Muslims in practice, or I should say Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs in the areas that had been Jordan or Gaza, generally existed in either active cooperation or at least in uneasy cooperation. There were plenty of jobs for Palestinian laborers. They made good money. Many of them worked very well with their Israeli neighbors, even in the so-called settlements in the areas that Israel began to settle when there was no peace treaty and they realized that the temporary military locations were not going anywhere. The Israelis went to West Bank locations and went to the old city of Jerusalem for purchases, and there was a kind of economic cooperation. That began to fall apart in 1987. The incident which started the Intifada had to do with something in near Gaza, but fairly quickly it came to have rock throwing at vehicles and the beginning of an unraveling of Palestinian Arabs inside the West Bank relationships with Jews in practice. The other thing about the Intifada was that it was a kind of coming of age of the local individuals. They had had very, very little clout. The PLO supposedly represented them, but they were entirely external to the West Bank. The Intifada had some local leadership and represented a new stage. By 1988, Arafat was beginning to talk about the readiness of accepting the existence of Israel. King Hussein relinquished his claims on Jerusalem, sort of. In 1989, the Soviet Union began to fall apart. The Soviet Union had been a broad supporter of the Arabs on in this conflict. All this would change with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and the resulting Gulf War, a broad coalition, and the convening of a conference as a result of the broad coalition of Arabs as well as Americans who opposed Saddam Hussein. 1993 had a rather interesting surprise. The Oslo Accords were a back channel, as it were. The Madrid Conference set up the idea of peace between Palestinians and Israelis. In fact, the Palestinians were represented explicitly as part of a Jordanian contingent, but they were explicitly represented. The Oslo Accords were a kind of back channel negotiated in Norway on the sly by political scientists and activists and so on, but they were accepted by Arafat and by Yitzhak Rabin. And there was a handshake on the lawn of the White House on September 13th in 1993. There was Jewish as well as Arab antagonism to this. The most important Jewish responses were a massacre in Hebron by Barak Goldstein in 1994, which led to the outlawing of the party, or I should say, which Goldstein represented the Kach party, a party of Meir Kahane, and his party was outlawed as being inconducive to Israeli democratic traditions. In 1995, on November 4th, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated also by a modern Orthodox extremist. Netanyahu was elected not so much because Rabin was assassinated, but because 1994-1995 also saw an increasing rage of terror by Hamas extremists who were also against the pact and did not want to have a Jewish state, the Israeli state, recognized in any way. So that during this period of time, not only did you have these two Jewish events that I put on the timeline, but you also had a number of other attacks on Jews. And Netanyahu was elected, I think, entirely because of concerns for Israeli security. Nevertheless, Netanyahu never denied at that point the idea that the Oslo process would lead to a Palestinian state if Israeli security could be assured, a statement which he made in very recent times. I'm recording this in March of 2015, just after the Israeli elections on March 17th. Netanyahu recently said that he did not see a Palestinian state as emerging during his prime ministership. I do not know whether deep in his heart he feels that it will ever emerge, but he certainly feels that the situation today is such that it's unlikely that it will emerge soon, and this is entirely because of their commitment to Hamas and their lack of commitment to taking the steps which Netanyahu feels would be necessary for Israeli security. Be that as it may, the next thing on my PowerPoint is 2000. Clinton met with this Barak, is Ehud Barak, not Barack Obama, and Arafat at Camp David. And Clinton supposedly offered Arafat, with Ehud Barak's agreement, almost everything that Arafat wanted. There is some discussion as to exactly what it was. I tend to believe Dennis Ross, who was the chief negotiator, who said Arafat got everything or nearly everything that he wanted. Excuse me, and some of Arafat's claims otherwise are just simply not tenable. In any case, Arafat walked away. My guess is that this has to be looked at, that he didn't get something that he wanted, and he also didn't feel that even the best offer he could get could be sold to his public. The first Intifada started in 1987 and seems to have been spontaneous. Most people believe the second Intifada was centrally planned. It started in 2000 and went on until 2005. The response to the second Intifada is quite important and has many ramifications up to this day. There were targeted removals. This means assassinations of leading people. There was increased human intelligence. There was the creation of the security barrier, the wall of separation that people talk about today. And there was a policy to isolate Arafat. Regardless of what people think of this, the response to the second Intifada was extremely successful, and on the internal basis, inside the areas that are controlled by Israel and by the Palestinian Autonomous Authority, inside those areas, the level of activity, the level of extremism that had been seen in 2000, 2005 completely disappeared. Although, as I speak, in 2015, last summer, there was increased hostility in the area of Hebron and the Gush Emunim and inside Jerusalem, and there was the bombing from Gaza and so on. On the whole, I would say the separation barrier and the isolation of Gaza and the West Bank has worked from a security viewpoint for the Israelis. I'm ending the narration here, even though I'm recording it in 2015. What I just said about the effectiveness of the security barrier for Israeli security relates fairly well to Palestinian Arab security as well, although the fact of the matter is that most Palestinians, most Arabs living in the West Bank and Gaza feel that they are completely ringed in by Israeli settlements. Their mobility is difficult. It's hard to get passes to go to the Israeli side of the barrier. In many cases, the barrier makes it impossible for them to get to the fields where they work or get to offices in Jerusalem or whatever it is. And I'm not trying to argue that it's an ideal situation when I said that. In 2015, looking back, we see an American attempt to moderate between Israelis and Arabs to create a peace deal in 2014. I don't know whether it ever had a chance of success. Reports seem to indicate that the Israelis and Palestinians agree on all of the major details and are diametrically opposed in some of their approaches to the most important, I'll say, identity issues or approach issues. So that even though they agree on they agree on many of the actual details, no progress is likely to occur. Be that as it may, the purpose of this narrative, the purpose of this PowerPoint was to give something of an overview of the history of Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel and some of the main points of its history since then. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you learned from it. And at this point in 2015, I'm not going to include the most recent events. They are fresh in our minds, and perhaps the next iteration in a few years will give a little bit more perspective as to how they actually worked out. Thank you very much for your attention.